your next step is the foundation of your future. And by extension of that, where you're standing right now is the accumulation of all your previous steps.
Dory 1, this is Fire Team Delta. Dad's coming home. Welcome to the Military Veteran Dad Podcast, where it is our mission to bring every dad home. I am your host, Ben Colloy. I'm a United States Marine veteran, husband, and a father. We will bring authentic conversations to inspire action in your life so we can close the gap between the dad you are today and the dad you want to be tomorrow. This is the Military Veteran Dad Podcast. Welcome back to Military Veteran Dad, episode 108. Guys, today, this episode with Joel Stewart hits in a way that we've had on the podcast, but we do it in a very different way, and I can't tell you how excited I am for today's podcast. So Joel Stewart is a very awesome guy because he's a United States Navy veteran. He's founder of the International Franchise Market. So we talk a little bit about franchising, which is something we've had a previous guest in the podcast about. He's a now author of The Value Equation. He's just an amazing individual. And also his story of what he had to go through. He had something that happened to him health-wise, and I'll save it for the episode for it to be unpacked. But there is a story where he pretty much got put in a wheelchair and he had his whole life pulled out from under him. And he had to kind of rebuild from that. And he had to learn a lot of hard lessons the hard way. But those lessons now have made him a stronger individual, a stronger dad. And everything about his life is now aligned in a way that he's loving where he's headed. And as always, guys, if you want to hear my big takeaway of this episode, hang on to the other side of the episode and I'll be back on the microphone. But other than that, let's get started with today's episode of Joel Stewart. Welcome to the podcast, Joel.
Well, thank you.
Reading a little bit of backstory on you, you've got an incredible story of going through a lot of shit that life has thrown at you. So I want you to open up right away. Tell us a bit about your family. Tell us a little bit, a few of those maybe struggles that we're going to hear about today, and just tell us who Joel Stewart is.
Well, Joel Stewart is a very interesting guy. Let me tell you about him. No, sometimes I think it's that our struggles that really kind of define us and mold us. When we look around and we see the people that don't seem to go through the struggles, they're really kind of shallow and weak people. Yeah, I actually had a theory about this, and I didn't even mean to go this direction, especially in the beginning, but I put out this theory a while ago called the logic of life experiences. And that is that everything that we go through and how hard it is for us to go through it, it always ties back to our hardest life experience that we've gone through so far. And that's the measure of it. So if you've gone through something really difficult, everything in the future, difficulty is measured against that thing you've gone through, and everything is going to be easier in general. And you see a lot of people that may not have gone through a lot of difficult things, and it seems like everything is horrible. Everything is drama. Everything is like the hardest thing because they don't have any. So for them, like their measure of what is difficult is a very low bar. And so by extension, almost everything is difficult. And it's actually kind of funny because their reality is that it's difficult. And then for people that have gone through things that are objectively much more difficult, they look at it and they're like, wow, that's crazy. I can't believe that you find that difficult. So for me in my life, I've gone through, a fair number of pretty difficult things. And I guess we can start there. When I was in the Navy, I started getting like these really just kind of random symptoms. I started getting fatigue. And to just wind it back to the beginning, like I'm sitting there and I'm getting ready for the next PRT. And 1 week I realized I can't finish the workout that I'd just done the week before. You know how normally you work out, the next week you do a little bit more, and the next week you do a little bit more, and you're progressively building up to this like peak level of physical performance. And I couldn't do it. And then the next week I could do even less. And the week after that, I could do even less. And I couldn't figure out what was happening. And it just, over a period of 6 months, it just continued to devolve to the point where fatigues had set into such a level I couldn't even drive anymore. My wife had to drive me around because my arms would fatigue on the steering wheel. And And then even beyond that, I had to get like a motorized wheelchair because I couldn't walk around anymore. So that kind of set in for what was probably the hardest period of my life. The darkest period was in Bethesda, where they were putting me through all kinds of the Naval Hospital there. They were putting me through all kinds of tests and everything. But nobody could actually figure out what was wrong. But eventually it did hit a limit where it stopped and things got a teeny bit better. But during that darkest point, I was getting pushed around the hospital in a wheelchair by my wife. I couldn't drive. Sometimes I couldn't even chew because my jaw would fatigue so bad. They gave me diagnoses of chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, basically all this stuff where it's like, we don't know what's wrong with you. And so you kind of loosely fit in these categories. One of the other ones was POTS, Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia syndrome, where when I would stand up, my heart rate would go up to 160 on standing within a minute, just from standing up. So bunch of really crazy random stuff. And that got to the point where I couldn't sleep. Every time I moved, there'd just be this cascade of joint pain through my body. And that's when people talk about suicidal ideations, I actually understand what that means now. It's like, you don't want thoughts of suicide to come. They just do. And you just keep trying to push them out of your head, and they just keep coming at you unbidden. Cause I went through that for about 3 months. And it was really painful to just watch my life unravel over a period of, 6 months to a year. I was married. My daughter was a year old. My wife was pregnant with our second one. When I was in Bethesda, our daughter was 1.5 years. So she was there with us. Yeah, it was tough. And then when they never figured out what was wrong with me, but things did get a little bit better, to the point where I could basically lay around in a chair and not do anything. And the Navy eventually separated me, medically retired me, because I couldn't do anything. I couldn't go into work. And my life just went into this holding pattern for like 5 years where it never really got any better, never really got any worse. It was just there. And it was so hard to just like watch people's lives go by. My wife teases me all the time because at some point in this, the movie WALL-E came out, and here's the story of this little robot that just like watches life go by and can't do anything. And I just like started crying at this cartoon about a robot of this guy who's just watching everyone's life go by while he goes around and does his thing. But yeah, so then when I started going to a chiropractor on a regular basis, which kind of kicked off this next level of my life, I should say, if I were to break things down into levels. Because once I started going to this chiropractor 3 times a week, I got to the point where I could sit up in a chair for an hour, which after not being able to sit up, I was basically a recliner, my bed or my recliner was it for years. And I could sit up for an hour. And that's when I said, if I can sit up for an hour, I have to try to do something. And I went back to school for my MBA. And that was a whole nother struggle by itself, because I could sit up for an hour, but I couldn't sit up for 3 hours, which is what a class was. And there were times where, I had to get up in the middle of class and just lay down in the back of the room, or go out into the hallway and lay down in the hallway. I mean, luckily there were night classes, so, there weren't a lot of people there. But it's what I had to do, and I did it. And driving, I could drive, but I had like recline almost all the way back. So I'm sitting like in the, I could almost stick my arm out the back window of the car. I was reclining so far back, but driving back and forth to these classes. That's when I kind of realized the difference between a disability mindset and one that is more of an entrepreneurial mindset. Is that the epiphany hit me is that it's not about what you can't do. It's about what you can do. And I wish I'd had that epiphany years ago. There were 5 years there where there were an enormous number of things that I couldn't do. And because I was so focused on that, I missed out on all the stuff that I could have been, there's stuff I could have been doing. And I was so focused on all the stuff that I'd lost and I wasn't focused on all the potential that was.
I have a similar feeling when I sat in Okinawa for 3 years playing Xbox. No kids, roof over my head, 3 squares a day, no responsibilities other than to show up to work, and I didn't do a damn thing. And now I got 3 kids trying to do all these things, and I'm like, I would just crave for that season of my life back. I would own the moon.
I wasted all that time. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So that's when and then finally things did resolve themselves. So I mean, we're talking, probably 6 years after I got medically retired, and I figured out what was happening, and I got out of that, and I started in earnest trying to restart my career, restart my life.
What did they figure out?
Oh, it's the most bizarre thing.
Like a good episode of House?
The best description that I can come up with is actually from a documentary called What's with Wheat, and they called it non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There was a lady at the end of the video that described almost everything I went through exactly for her. But it was basically some kind of, it's hard because it's one of those things where the mainstream medical community doesn't embrace it, but the homeopathic community does. But everything the homeopathic community described played out exactly me. Yeah. So another way to call it is leaky gut syndrome, but a lot of mainstream medical community will say that doesn't exist. But the description of it, as they say, and I'm not saying that this is true one way or the other, is that you're basically your gut lining gets compromised. Food proteins start leaking into your bloodstream, and your body recognizes bacterial infections by protein signatures. And so your body starts to grab onto these food proteins and starts to think that they're an infection. And your body starts going into this life or death fight with these proteins that are actually your food. That's the best description that seemed to make sense to me. And so basically the most common, it could be any food protein. People that claim they struggle with leaky gut syndrome will tell you it could be anything. For me, I did a complete isolation diet where I cut out everything but red meat and green vegetables. And when I started adding stuff back, it was potatoes, peanuts, and gluten. Basically, whenever I would eat those foods, my body would just go into this like crazy reaction, and then the full body inflammation, the heart symptoms. I mean, basically the food was like messing with my whole central nervous system. There was actually a period where I went through, I can actually kind of sympathize with women going through menopause. There was a period where I went through hot flashes. My temperature would just go between 97 and 99 throughout the course of the day, and I'd be like freezing, and then I'd just be like covered in sweat. Just all these random central nervous system issues. And as far as I can tell, it was tied to a severe reaction to food. And it's just killed. Yeah, I just changed my diet. I did an elimination diet, and within a week, but really within 2 weeks, but within a week, I noticed a huge difference. And within 2 weeks, it was like I was a whole new person. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't. After everything that I went through. So now every time that someone says they have fibromyalgia, they have chronic fatigue syndrome, they have POTS, I'm like, hey, have you checked your diet? And they're like, oh, you're crazy. I'm like, no, seriously.
And the only thing you really did to heal yourself was just pay attention to what went inside your body?
So for me, I mean, anybody listening to this, like if you or someone you know is dealing with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, POTS, especially POTS, really look at the diet aspect of it. It's crazy.
That's the crazy part. Even if you don't like what you're talking about there with the very specific one, many doctors are not trained on nutrition. A psychiatrist will issue a prescription for depression before ever asking what you're eating, because that's how they're trained to solve a problem with a pill. And that's how their mind works. It's how, we have a great medical system in here that can save your life if you're in a car accident. But when it comes down to like truly the science of your body, there's a lot of lack of knowledge on the doctor part. I've loved doctors, but from the way the Western medicine society has approached it, anytime someone has a back problem or something where they just feel broken or they've been labeled broken, like you'll never do this again, I always tell them, go find out a community of people just like you, and you'll find there are so many people out there redefining their life with advice that goes against Western medicine. So there's a popular question I like asking when people have gone through kind of a pit of what you went through. What do you think you learned from that this was the best vehicle that, say, if you look at it from a God perspective, like, what did you really deeply learn through this 5-year process? And maybe it was that wisdom as well, but like, what did you learn that you couldn't learn before? And that maybe this was the best vehicle for you to really learn it, that you've now taken back control of. And you're like, man, I'm really glad that I had that slap in the face, even though it sucked. And now you're like, I can't imagine living without it.
Oh gosh. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that it broke my male ego, if that makes any sense. A lot of
sense.
people, especially guys, and being a guy, I'm coming from that perspective. The male ego is so incredibly fragile, and the closer it gets to breaking, the more violent or outbursts we tend to have. And then once it's broken, our self-worth gets stripped away, because the male ego, we build up this caricature of who we are, and we put so much self-worth into that caricature. And when we fall short of this imaginary person that we think that we are, it is incredibly hard on us. And so when this thing happened, I mean, my male ego of the person that I thought that I was just gone, and it was just me that was left. And honestly, I don't miss it. Now that I'm just kind of more of a raw person, once that male ego is gone, and you talked about from a God perspective, I mean, once you realize that all the things that you were putting your value in were gone, and it's basically, you have to rely on God's view of you instead of your view of yourself. You become a much more grounded person, much less volatile, and much less competitive.
Less able to be pushed over.
Yeah, it's I am who I am now. I'm not striving to be,
get butt hurt less easy.
Yeah, I'm not striving to.
Have you ever read Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl?
No.
You would love it, because that book talks about Dr. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he talks about finding a reason to live in the middle of misery, that he's stripped away from his family. He's surrounded by death. He's surrounded at a concentration camp with evil. And he talks about the mindset that he had to develop and how that mindset got him through being in that camp and surviving, because he was able to win the war in his mind and his heart, and able to not thrive, because you're not going to thrive in a concentration camp, but he was able to keep the will to live alive in very dire circumstances. I read that book at the beginning of quarantine, and that book, man, did it strip away so much crap. And like, every page has a piece of wisdom that you need to highlight and remember forever, because it's just a deep, dark book that has a light of truth in it, that in the darkest of dark, there is still ability to find light. And that's what he did.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And then, so then the other thing is, the ability to have more compassion on people that are also suffering with these things. I mean, like, again, you said, from a biblical perspective, I mean, in the Bible, it talks about how after you go through things, you can try to help out and comfort other people that are going through it. I went through something that most people can't really relate to, and they can't really understand. And, one of the hardest things I had to go through was that on the outside, I looked normal. If you just looked at me laying in my recliner chair, you wouldn't know that there was anything
just
wrong
look lazy.
with me. Yeah. Like, oh, there's that lazy guy laying in his chair all day.
Yeah.
So it was, my heart breaks for people that are in that situation, because I know that how much they're struggling, and a lot of military guys deal with it too. It's the same thing with like PTSD and stuff. You can look at it and you can look totally fine on the outside, but on the inside, like, you're just hurting. And people they don't understand that. And then
there was this book that I read by Morgan Schneider that really helped me tap into this wisdom from God. and was becoming a king. And he put it beautifully when he was on the podcast talking about it, that it takes a lot of shit to make good soil, and rich soil creates a strong life. And so you're almost fortunate that you had a big pile of shit dumped early on, because now the soil is that much more fertile for everything else to go. Sometimes people don't get tested till they're 50, and that soil doesn't have the nutrients to really thrive. And sometimes I almost wish I had more adversity when I was younger, because I would have a richer soil to tap into now versus what I wouldn't have if I would have had that happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's where it says again in the, looking at the Bible, is talks about all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And with that, what that really talks to is hope. And it's hope that no matter what it is that you're going through, that a purpose can be drawn from it, that meaning can be drawn from it, that it's not useless, it's not pointless. And so for me going through this, I lost 5 years of my life, 5 years of professional development, 5 years where I wasn't able to keep up with friendships, and I just kind of, didn't go anywhere. And then out of that came, a hunger to get back out there. And I followed a new life progression I never would have followed. If I hadn't gotten sick, I definitely wouldn't have moved back to Connecticut. I wouldn't have, reconnected with my family with the way that I have. I wouldn't have gotten into commercial real estate and business brokerage, which I didn't really like either of those things, but both of those things led to franchise consulting, which I do now, which I love. So, all of those things, I went through it, and it totally redirected my life. And I fully believe that there was a purpose behind all of it. And by the same extension, once you realize that, once you grab onto that symbol of hope, you can realize that even when you're going through tough stuff, that there's a purpose behind it, that there's hope behind it. And the beautiful thing about hope is that if you have hope, you can get through anything. It's when hope is gone. That's why politicians try to leverage hope. That's why marketers try to leverage hope. You buy our product, and we're gonna, solve whatever problem it is that's plaguing your life, or you have this problem plaguing your life. You might not even know it, but you do, and we're gonna solve it for you. Hope is so powerful, and if you can control somebody's hope, you can control them. But if your hope is in something that no one can take away, you've got something in your life that is solid, that's real, that you can always cling to. And it's
interesting that you mentioned hope, because a huge part of my story is realizing that I was outsourcing my hope. And so if my life sucked, it was everybody else's problem that I outsourced it to. Like, I gave you a job. You're supposed to help me feel hopeful. Like, my job progression and my career progression is your problem, not mine. And when I don't get what I want, I can blame you. And I remember listening to a Zig Ziglar episode. I was on the way to work. I was in front of the Ace Hardware, maybe 5 minutes from there. That's how impactful. This was like maybe 6 years ago. I can still remember. It was in the morning. The sun was shining. And there's Tom Ziglar was on there, and he mentioned a John Maxwell quote that I often use in my coaching now is, if there's hope in the future, there's power in the present. And at that time, when I felt that and really heard that quote, it unlocked that when the outsourcing breaks and someone doesn't do their job, I blue screen like a computer and I just shut down. I feel like the whole world just crashes when my hope goes away. But when I have hope, man, I can do anything. But I wasn't actually in charge of creating my own hope. So it was always everybody else's fault that my life sucked versus my own. And it was a radical accountability to bring that hope back in and generate it on my own. Because once you create a perpetual engine of hope on your own, like, there's no stopping you, because it doesn't matter what people say. You already believe that you are enough, and you believe that you are hopeful enough to get and achieve the dreams you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, that's what breaks my heart with modern. I don't want to get into politics, but both sides of the aisle, everyone, when I see people outsourcing their hope,
too much trust in, I've heard it said you have a better chance of affecting your life by focusing on your school board elections than you do for president or Congress. But no one ever gives your school board elections, which actually could affect the education your kids receive. They'll focus on the big ones when the big ones have really no impact able to achieve your life. Even in COVID, until everybody got a check from the government, It's probably the most impactful the government was able to touch every single life in the United States. Other than that, you're living your own life, and very little what they do in Washington is going to affect you.
But people outsource their hope, and then when the other person gets elected, either way, like your social media, everything gets flooded with these
going to be
hopelessness.
guaranteed to suck. Yes.
I'm just like, oh gosh, stop giving these people your hope. Stop it. Stop.
And it's part of the idea that you aren't responsible for your own life, which I think is also a theme for even veterans. I think this is something we struggle from, because when we are serving, we're not really responsible for our own life. We're really responsible for showing up and doing what we're told and being where we're supposed to be. But when you transition out, there is so much internal accountability that you need to bring back. Like, there's no reveille at 5:30 to wake you up. There's no taps to remind you to appreciate the flag. None of that exists, and you have to find it on your own. And it's like recreating that code within yourself to recognize that while I served a higher purpose and accountability that was above myself. When you transition out, it's about bringing that internal accountability to myself, because no one else is going to care about my life as much as I do. So I got to ask a question. When you answered that big question of, it's not what I can't do right now, it's what I can do. That's a big question. And a lot of veterans get stuck in, I have no idea what I like doing. And they have no idea where their life goes. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I talk to that have no vision for next week. They have no vision barely sometimes for tomorrow, because they're just running on autopilot, the basic American dream of go to job, get to work, do everything you're supposed to, but not really worry about tomorrow when really what you care about. What have you learned in that process that you could help unpack for other veterans to answer that question? What can I do tomorrow? Because it's a big question and a good one, but a lot of veterans get stuck on having the right answer.
Well, I actually wrote a whole book about this.
Perfect. A perfect tee up to the book.
Yeah, I wrote a book called The Value Equation, and I basically take a look at all the factors that feed into that take-home check. I call it realized value, because you have so much potential that you've built up over your lifetime. But how much of that potential are you actually realizing? How much of it is showing up in that monthly or weekly take-home check? And it's one of those things where, unless you have that epiphany that says, oh, this I can actually apply to my life, everything is just kind of amorphous. It's just kind of like, yeah, more random advice. So I built the book around trying to create those epiphany moments in people and saying, oh, here is an actionable step that I can take. And then I'm actually going to be putting it out hopefully over this weekend. I actually built a workbook to help people go through with this. But basically, I break it down into five main parts of your life that you need to focus on. The first is your skills. And that is something that a lot of veterans have an actual enormous number of skills. And they may not realize it because they may think, I have the stuff I did in the military doesn't apply to the civilian life. But the skills that you learn in the military when it comes to, leadership is pushed at every level. Leadership development, personal development is actually pushed pretty hard for soft skills. And soft skills can be applied almost anywhere. So the first thing you need to look at is skill development, and what can you do so that you're developing skills continuously. And one of the ways that I describe this is I say that your next step is the foundation of your future. And by extension of that, where you're standing right now is the accumulation of all your previous steps. So your life is sitting on a foundation that you have built over years of taking one step after another, developing skills and relationships and networking, and all of that is accumulated in where you're sitting right now. And that it could be a great foundation or it could be a terrible one, because not everyone makes the best decisions. But the point is that where you are right now is what it is, but the next step you take is not set in stone. The next step you take, you have control over. And once you take that step, that is the new life foundation for you. And once you're on that new foundation, you're going to be taking another step, and that's going to be a new foundation. And so once you start to look at your life as a series of foundational steps and not just random walking around doing whatever. Once you look at it as the next thing that I do, my whole life is going to be founded on that next action, that next step, that next development. You can start to build up something, and you can start that anywhere at any point in life. It's just about planning, and it's about, recognizing what that next step's got to be. So I talk about all the different ways that you can develop skills. I talk about everything from educational stuff to what you do for hobbies and extracurricular activities and programs and platforms, all of that stuff. And that kind of sets the master value that you have in the marketplace. And then I talk about fit factor. So, if a CEO gets a job as a cashier, that's not a good fit for their skills, right? They're not going to get paid their maximum amount. So there's a bunch of stuff that factors that go into whether or not what you're doing fits with your skill set. And I talk about how to try to maximize that. And then I talk about profit share. So this boils down to being an employee versus a business owner versus getting into a partnership or a franchise business, which, it's my specialty is franchising. I actually don't adopt that much time in the book to franchising. But there's different ways that you get compensated for your time, and how you structure your employment relationships, how you structure your pay as an employee, and whether or not you decide to do a side business. So I have all kinds of ideas for side businesses or when you should start a business versus employment. All that's in profit share. So, if you bring, $200,000 of market value to the table, how much of that 200,000 do you get to keep? Is it 100,000? Is it 50,000? Is it 30,000? So that's where that plays in. And then there's perceived value, which is the different ways that people see you and how that correlates to money. So in this section, I talk about networking. I talk about community involvement. I talk about being proactive in the workplace. Lots of different stuff to cover and perceive value. One of the big things I focus on is understanding bias and understanding where it comes from. Everyone has bias. There's been a fair amount of attention recently because of the recent state of politics on confirmation bias. And that is how likely you are to believe something's true just because you already sort of agree with it on some level. So that's where fake news comes out, and people automatically believe fake news is real news because it matches their confirmation bias. But confirmation bias, or just, bias in general, we all have it towards everything. It could be you're that parent, right? And you've got one kid that can't do anything right and the other one that does everything right. Well, the parent that has that bias, that the kid that does everything right, that kid would have to destroy the world before that parent would realize, hey, my bias is wrong. And if they have the bias towards the other one that thinks they do everything wrong, it's the exact opposite. They would have to, change the world in order for that parent to think that kid, and this correlates to the workplace. If your boss thinks that you're a piece of trash that's never going to do anything right, getting that boss to change their perspective is going to be an enormous feat. And I actually recommend in the book, it's better to go get another job and just impress the crap out of the new boss. Because if you can have them come at you with them thinking that you are an incredible employee, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt in the future. So I focus a lot on understanding what bias is and how you can take steps to make sure that you are being seen in the best possible light, because you want people to give you that benefit of the doubt. You want people to think that, when you mess up, that's not who you are. That's just an accident or something, because that makes a huge difference in how valuable you're perceived in the workplace. And then I talk about courage. So nothing matters if you don't have the courage to do it. And I kind of break down my perspective on courage, how fear is important, and how courage is something that can be broken down into distinct steps that are manageable, instead of trying to look at something as this big thing. Because I've done a lot of that. I've done international conferences for franchising. I still remember that first franchise conference I did over in Oman, and just the way that I had to break that down, because the idea of not just trying to set up a franchise conference in another country, but come up with content. What happens if I do something that's really stupid, or what if people have questions that I don't know? I had to just break it down step by step into manageable chunks that I had the courage to overcome, and just take it one step at a time. that's my book in a nutshell. I mean, I have concrete examples. I have case studies I follow. Everything is designed so that people have that epiphany moment that says, oh yeah, this is something that I can do. And it's just like, like when we started on talking about this, it's not about what you can't do. It's about what you can. And so just along those lines, the book is designed to get people to say, here's something I can do. Here's a direction that I can take my life. And then the workbook that I'm going to be putting out shortly takes that kind of to a whole nother level of trying to really break down your life and focus on what are the 3 things that I can do right now to be moving forward. Sorry, that was kind of a long explanation. I hope I didn't bore everybody too much.
No, it was perfect. And I think you nailed so many heads for different topics out there and went into areas that we don't often go into. So it was kind of like a Picasso of all those different things. And the biggest issue that many veterans have when they do end up taking their own life is they could come to the conclusion they aren't a person of value and they're more of a burden to society than they are a person of value. So if you think of that mindset and then a book that's clearly designed to lay out how you are a person of value and how you can rewire your brain, there's a good Zig Ziglar quote that really I found back in like 2014 that kind of drove my whole self-growth journey. It was, I am who I am because of what has gone in my mind. I can change where I am and who I am by changing what goes in my mind. And that book sounds like a classic example that you can completely rewire how your lens of life looks. And it's no longer beer goggles. It's clear, maybe not crystal, because that takes a lot of freaking work to get to that, even crystal. I don't know if anybody ever gets there. But just being able to see the world in a different light than you currently do today. And just said it beautifully. I want to go to a different topic that we do talk quite a bit on the podcast, but I'm interested to see your take because to me as a dad and as military dad, we have a leg up, I feel like, because we understand and see the world with a different set of eyes that the other 83 or 93% of the population in the United States does not. And that is how to raise our kids to understand their value. So like I have 2 daughters and I shortcut my basic fundamental rule is that if they can become 18 and not get their value as a woman from Instagram and the number of followers and likes they get on a post, I've succeeded. There's probably a lot of other things below that, but like that's my bare minimum, that if they can derive their value from the inside and not the outside, because Instagram to me is like a trap for so many people growing up, especially at that younger age. They see their worth determined by other people. And that's like the hope. I mean, you nailed it right there with hope, that the likes that you get on a post determines how hopeful you feel that day. And if you post and maybe you worked an hour on this post or whatever you did, and you only got 2 likes, you're like, oh man, I must be a piece of crap. So I'm interested. How do you help your kids tap into their value equation? Because to me, our biggest objective as a dad is to help them do that. And you can't figure it out with 12 years of school. And it's my objective and mission to give my kids the widest view of the American dream so that they can get outside their life to figure out how they fit into it and really how they can help take their gifts and start changing the world.
I mean, all I can give is my perspective on this one. Our kids are similar ages. My oldest is a girl.
It's all theory at this point.
Yeah, it's all theory. You know, because my oldest is 10, and just on a side note, being a military parent, one of the things that I think I do enjoy the benefit of is being able to be like good dad, bad dad. It's like, oh yeah, I'm a loving father, but then when you screw up, it's just like, that's it, kid.
Yeah,
you're on your last life.
You can go both ways.
Yeah, right. So for me, what I've tried to do is focusing on their positives. You know, when they do something negative, you know, we have to focus and say, look, this is unacceptable behavior. But we have to put equal, and this is hard sometimes, especially when they're all over the place, but we have to put equal emphasis on encouraging the positive things that they do and encouraging positive values as we do on discouraging negative ones. Because if they're doing negative stuff and we're just all the time in their face about how all the stuff they're doing is negative, they're going to feel like that's who they are. And they're going to try to find that worth and that value from other people that are going to reinforce it. So, you know, with my kids, my oldest one is really great at art. And, you know, I try so hard to, you know, encourage her in that and enable her in that and and reinforce the good things that are happening and other ways that she can derive value, not just, from the outside, but from the stuff that she's doing and the work she's doing. And my son is pretty good at math. He's kind of following my own footsteps. My background's in engineering. He's a little closer to me than I'd probably like, but yeah, he's and honestly, sometimes I feel like he might even get a little less praise because my daughter is always making these incredible artsy things, and everybody's like, "Oh, that looks so great!" And and he didn't knock out advanced math, and everyone's just like, "Oh, just math." Yeah. So it's actually the stuff that he does is much less he gets a lot less visual encouragement, I think. But it's trying. It's hard. It's hard to balance encouragement and guidance with discipline.
Do you organize any field trips to help, like, for your daughter to understand what the art world looks like and the way that people generate a good living within the art world? Like, my daughter's into art as well, so I've thought about even doing like the art museum, which she's never been to. I'd probably hate it, but I would like it because I'm with her.
I think everything I know about the art world makes me wants me to keep her as far as possible.
But I think it's a classic example. Like what you're talking about is it's your confirmation bias. You're already determining it based on how you see the art world. And I'm sure if there's any art people listening to this podcast, they would disagree. And it's one of those where, to me, we just don't know it exists. Like franchising, another example. Most people probably think of franchise, and the only thing they can think of is fast food and maybe a few others. But there's such a deep, deep world that there are so many franchises that you could start to change your life. But everybody just assumes, like, yeah, there's no way I'm going to open a Jimmy John's because that's not me. And you're like, well, there's a lot more out there than Jimmy John's. I think it's the same thing with art. And so it sounds like maybe you both need to explore the space so that way you both are comfortable helping her enjoy her curiosity.
One of the things that we can focus on is, art is a product, and selling products is right down, the wheelhouse of an entrepreneur. So we're actually right now, there's like a local organic store, and they might actually start selling some of her stuff, some of her little clay creatures, for a couple bucks a piece. So she
that's a huge one right there, because most kids don't understand how to generate money or how it can come out of thin air, and that the only method is a W-2 job, which isn't true either. That's just another confirmation bias. And like, you're teaching her something like, I can take a skill, I can provide value, and I could create money out of nothing with something that just came from me. Like, to me, I wish I would have learned that a long time ago. I grew up on a farm, so I don't know why I didn't truly understand it, but my dad never slowed down to like say, this is what I'm doing and this is how it works. And so I had to figure out on my own the hard way. But like, I think you're opening up something there. And within entrepreneurship is something, there's a huge teaching tool within entrepreneurship of accepting control and responsibility and creating. And I think that is something, again, with being 10 years old, that seed, that could grow into a mighty oak later on. Like, you have no idea what kind of those seeds are going to go to.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is something that I'm pretty passionate about. But it's not the only way to go. Looking at my book, and I don't focus my book on entrepreneurship. I focus it on employment, entrepreneurship. There's something I have in my book called strategic employment, which is going for jobs for the skills you're going to learn on the job, not necessarily for the pay. And when I talk about market share in the profit share section, I say, I broke down some examples from a major US company, and they had like 60 billion in profits. And, I did some math on that. And it was kind of like, roughly speaking, the average employee made like 120,000, but they brought a total of around 600,000 in value to the company. So it was like this employee was making about 20% of the value they brought to the company. But that 20%, 120,000 is more than a lot of entrepreneurs make running their own business and getting 100% of the money. So there is definitely a place for employment and employment tracks and entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurship is the easiest way, in my mind, especially if you're struggling with disabilities, to focus on what you can do and not what you can't. Because when you focus on a job, it is the employer that decides the value and what is valuable to that job. And when you have disabilities, you may have 3 things that the employer thinks is great, but then your disabilities might have 2 things that the employer doesn't think is great. You might need to be able to sit in a chair for more than an hour, say. But when you're an entrepreneur, you can truly craft what it is that you can do and craft a way to make money around that. And it's kind of funny is I started writing a book called Defeating Disability using entrepreneurship. And I realized as I was writing that book, and it's kind of based on my story, I realized that I needed to write a whole nother book that talked about value, that talked about skills and all. So the value equation, the book that I wrote, is actually a prequel to the book that I initially wanted to write that I still plan on writing in the future, called Defeating Disability using entrepreneurship. Because entrepreneurship allows you to really hone in on what it is that you're able to do without somebody else telling you that you're not as valuable because of your disability.
You hit it right there on the head with the value. The whole thing was perfect and it's so easy when you listen to a podcast or when you see someone successful, you start establishing your own confirmation bias that those are the only ways that success can become. And then you start telling crappy stories like, yeah, that's not me. There's no way. I mean, there's a huge world where forever I told myself, you are not a podcaster. You are not like those people you hear on the radio. And I remember the first time that I played my introduction that I recorded way back in 2018. I hadn't released a podcast yet. And I just kind of played it through the car's Bluetooth. And it was a very eerie feeling hearing my voice on the radio. I was like, wow, this is about to happen. This voice is really about to ready to be played on people's car radios. And for 5 years, I had been hearing everybody else's voice and saying, there's no way I can be that guy. And then I eventually get the courage to go through it and find my value, which is this podcast. To wrap this interview up, because we've talked about a whole bunch of different things and I loved every single one of them. I want you to go into a place where tap into all the wisdom that you've come through all the shit that you've thought of and been through with your kids and whatever. Tell us that parting piece of advice that you want to share with us. That's going to be that piece of advice that we need to hear from your life that other dads maybe won't learn because they didn't go through your life in the way you've gone through it.
Well,
lead from the heart. That's the best advice.
Lead from the heart. Well, I think the biggest piece of advice is that the past doesn't define your future. There's a whole nother concept that we never got into called, I like to call it career prison, which is one of the foundational motivational aspects of what I do as a franchise consultant, is that I like to help break people out of career prison. But the basic definition I came up with for career prison is that your past is defining your future. Everything you've done in the past is defining where you're going to go in the future. But this concept is so much more applicable than just in an employment concept. No matter where you are, what you've done, what's happened to this point can't be changed. Past, you can learn from it, but you can't change it. And so when you let your past, something you can't change, define your future, it's natural, but it's also the epitome of stupid. Your future has not been set. Everything that you can do with raising your kids, with the way that you approach your kids, the way that you approach your life, everything in the future can be changed, is malleable. And if you're looking back at your life, how it's gone with your kids, or things that haven't worked with your kids or haven't worked in your life, don't let that define the way that you decide to move into the future. Don't let your past define your future. The future is not set, and it can be, whatever it is that you are able to make it.
That is perfect, because even if you apply that to a dad listening to this that feels like a crappy dad, there is so much to that label that feels permanent. Even if you don't apply it to a crappy dad, maybe it's to, God, will my kids ever sleep because we have a newborn, and you feel like this feeling is permanent? No, their kids will sleep at some point. This is just a season of life that you're going through. and that the future is always evolving. And something about our mind and our psyche applies a permanence to the future based on how we feel now and in the past. And it's the idea of breaking free from that and understanding, like you've talked about, the future is malleable. Your thoughts can shape how you see it. And if you want to think differently about the future, you need to start thinking differently about present. And then the whole thread starts going through. So where can people get in touch with you and follow you more on social media? And if they want to learn more about your franchise stuff, or even just get in touch with your book?
Yes. Well, on LinkedIn and Facebook, I'm Joel Stewart, MBA. You just should be able to just type that in and it shows up. You can feel free to email me if you want to, joel.stewart@integritycommercial.biz. And that's also my website, integritycommercial.biz. My book is called The Value Equation. I've got a website, thevalueequation.org. And I've got a whole bunch more book projects that I'm working on. I actually have one that the rough draft is done on right now. I'm going to be calling it Franchising Unlocked, the 7 Secret Keys to Franchise Ownership. So that one's going to be more along my wheelhouse, my franchise niche for people that want to get into franchising. And I'm hoping to have that out in a couple of weeks. But the value equation is like where that's just like my heart just put into a book. You know, the fact that the idea of escaping career prison and keeping your life moving forward is something, it's an idea that's very personal to me through my own struggles. And it's the reason I got into franchise consulting to begin with. But franchise consulting is just one way to keep your life moving forward. It's just one way to break out of career prison and move on to something you actually like doing. And so I really hope that, people just go and check out The Value Equation. The Kindle version's, only like $10. And I really hope that it can, cause some epiphanies for you, or if you know people, people that are going to be graduating high school or college or getting out of the military, anyone that's in a life transition, the book is really kind of perfect for to help them get clarity on what their next step needs to be.
Well, that sounds perfect. And I'll include all those links for the socials, the link for the book in the show notes. So you don't have to worry about writing all that down. Just head over to militaryveterandad.com, or it's also in the show notes for wherever podcast player that you're using. Joel, this episode has been awesome. And we didn't talk about it today, but you actually contracted COVID, which delayed this episode by 2 weeks. So I don't know if your performance was better today or just as good as it would have been before you caught COVID. But I'm super glad that you made it through COVID, because this episode needed to happen. And I loved the value that we talked about today.
Yeah, I'm a COVID survivor. I need to get a t-shirt so that I survived COVID.
I haven't seen more COVID survivor t-shirts. I feel like
really,
that's a whole empire waiting to be tapped into.
I survived COVID, and all I got is another 6 to 12 months of ongoing symptoms.
That should be like a t-shirt at Target or something where you walk in. Maybe no one wants to advertise they had it. I don't know. Well, Joel, thank you very much for giving us some of your time today.
All right. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's show with Joel Stewart. This episode, like I said in the beginning, went into so many of the areas that we need to talk about more about on the podcast. And I loved that we got a chance to do it with Joel Stewart, because his story and the richness of his story of rising through what he went through and coming on the other side and being who he is now and finding the value, as he talks about, in who he is now and what he can do and what he can offer and how he can help people find their real value through franchising. And so much of with what his book does, The Value Equation, is just help many people find their value and worth and understanding the path that they can take. I love the advice about taking the different steps. That was something that was my big takeaway. I loved the simplicity of what he was talking about there. And if you listen to the podcast, I'm a big Frozen proponent. I did a Fatherhood Friday episode way back in the beginning of 2020. In that episode, I broke down why every veteran has a little Elsa inside them. And in Frozen 2, there is a line in that movie that relates to exactly what Joel said, where when the future is unknown, all you can do is take the next right step. And that's the core of what Joel's advice was talking about, is the accumulation of where you are is the accumulation of the steps you take. Tomorrow, the step that you take can be one in a completely new direction. There is no cement that says that your path has to be aligned, that the future really is completely open. There's been a couple men that I've been coaching lately, and some advice that I've given them, because they're in a situation where they're removed from their family, they're not a part of their kids' daily lives, their marriage is on the rocks, and they're completely isolated. And I told them the advice that, like, you've got an opportunity where every essentially step is possible. You have so much abundant of time. You can learn, listen, practice new skills, try new things. Now, while that situation that they're in really sucks, there is a lot of hope and opportunity to make a new direction without a lot of the barriers that if you're a dad like myself that is trying to do all these big different things, host podcasts, help dads do all these different things, raise 3 kids that are in the house, my wife's in the house, so my family is still together. There's a lot of times where I may be envious of someone that, like, man, or even envious of previous times in my life. Like I've joked a couple times in the podcast, being bored in Okinawa and wasting all that time. Like, man, I get really enchanted with the amount of time I wasted just sitting there in my barracks room. I really could have been doing anything more productive than sitting there playing Xbox. So I want you to take away that, understand that the step you take tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, all of those days that you take can be a different step. If you feel like you've walked yourself into a corner, sometimes maybe you got to take a few steps back, figure out how to get out of the corner and be like, oh, there's a door over here that I could have taken, but instead I kept walking towards this corner in the room. And running into the corner is not going to change your path. You got to pull back, figure out, how did I get here? Get essentially your coordinates on the situation. Maybe a little bit like Land Nav, where you got to pull back and figure out what geography landmarks are around you to figure out where you are on the map. All of that goes back to remembering you can take a fresh new step no matter what your situation. And Andy Storch gave us this advice, as well as asking what is possible on that next step. Like, so many times I talk to dads, they have but this can't happen because of this, because of this, because of this. Just for a moment, I want you to take all that crap off the list. What do you really want to do? Like, figure out that question. If you didn't have all these excuses for why you can't do something, what would you really do with your time? Focus on that question, dive into it. If that question really resonated with you and you want to move forward, maybe you've been listening to the podcast and you're like, Ben keeps asking these really powerful questions, but I keep getting stuck on how to move for them. Head on over to bencloy.com. There is a free discovery call, 45-minute coaching call where I step into your life to essentially help you understand what's really going on. And the best way to explain it is, imagine a forest that just where you're on top, all you see is green, and the forest looks really healthy. But when you get down in the forest, you often can feel lost. And when you're looking above the forest, you can see the horizon. Maybe you can see a mountain that you need to head towards. But when you're in the forest, it's very difficult. And that's the perspective that a coach can provide. They can help see what's on the horizon. They can identify where you are within this forest and also help you get where you want to go. So if that sounds like something you want to do, again, head on over to bencloy.com, join in, and book a free discovery call. Those discovery calls for the men I've followed up with them, and they continue to say that those discovery calls are life-changing because they, for the first time in many years and months maybe, they feel hope for the first time that there is a better way to move forward. So guys, with that, I will wrap up, close out. If you have not left an iTunes review, those reviews are the lifeblood of our podcast on Apple. A huge portion of the listeners still exist on Apple for this podcast, and those reviews, I read every single one of them, and they mean the world to me. So if you have not done that, go ahead, head on over to iTunes, leave a review. Those reviews mean the world to me, as I said. So guys, with that, I'm signing off. Heading into the week. I will talk to you guys again on Friday. Have an amazing week. Do something epic. Find ways to be a dad. And always, you are loved, appreciated. You just need to realize it yourself.